So hello everybody again. Now it's time for one of our keynotes. And I'd like to welcome Munmun De Choudhury. And Munmun is a professor at the School of Interactive Computing at Georgia Tech, where she has also other affiliations in other centers like machine learning centers and the Institute for People and Technology. She's the founded and directs the Social Dynamics and Wellbeing Lab. And we are especially looking forward to the talk because mental health has been a kind of a thread through the conference and has been actually the focus of a lot of attention even before the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic and other issues exacerbated this kind of problems in society. And we, Munmun has been pioneering studies using social media as data to investigate mental health. And this is one of the main topics of the keynote, and we very much look forward to hearing more. Munmun, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and hello everybody from around the world. It's my absolute pleasure and honor today to have a chance to speak with you and share some of the research that we have been doing at the intersection of social media and mental health over the past several years. I'm going to be talking about some of the opportunities that we see in the space, what seems to have worked so far, but also importantly, what we are missing at the moment. And then through this talk, I'm going to conclude with some directions for future research about challenges that still remain unaddressed and which will be critical for us to see how the potential of these kinds of data and these technologies can actually have a positive impact on outcomes in the real world. Before I get started, I would note a content warning. This presentation does include some descriptions of serious mental illnesses, self-harm, suicidal ideation, and so on. So I would caution proceeding going forward if that is something that is troubling to anybody. All right, so we all know that, with the proliferation of different digital platforms, especially on the internet, we now have data and digital traces that are, left behind by millions of individuals. And over the past decade and a half, I would say, new types of investigations at the intersection of computer science and social science has tried to make significant inroads into improving our understanding of a number of different facets of human behavior and social phenomena. To give you some examples, these data now have provided us new ways that we can use to measure our social interactions, our moods and emotions, our political ideologies, our collective action, and most relevantly to this talk, our health and well-being. So in the initial part of this talk today, I will take the opportunity to share with you some of the highlights of the work that my collaborators, my students, and myself, we have been conducting over the past few years that showcases the possible computational uses of social media data for mental health. So in the past year and a half, 2 years, we have been experiencing a number of different crises in different parts of the world, including the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which isn't still quite over. So some of the examples that I'm going to take here will speak to some of these crisis events, and then the role that social media provides in helping us mental health during these very trying times that we are experiencing. And then what I'm going to do is in this conversation that I have early on in my talk, I'm going to take the social ecological model that is a pretty useful conceptual framework in the public health field to structure our discussion around potential of social media at the individual level, then at the community level, and then finally at the population level. All right, so focusing on the individual, one of the things that is so unique about crisis, if you think about them in today's digital age, is that they're frequently accompanied by misleading information that circulates on the web. So while a lot of the crises have a direct impact on people, it impacts people's lives in small and big ways. But a considerable number of us, we are also impacted indirectly because of our exposure to these kinds of misinformation. And what can be a better example of that than the COVID-19 pandemic? So to answer that question in this work, we studied how exposure to misinformation, as indicated by people's sharing behaviors of content on social media, it affects their psychological well-being. So what we did here was we conducted a large-scale observational study that was based on propensity score matching causal framework, and it included over 80 million Twitter postings that were made by nearly 80,000 Twitter users over the first year and a half of the COVID-19 pandemic. What did we find? We found that people who shared COVID-19 misinformation, they experienced approximately a 2 times additional increase in their anxiety levels compared to people who did not share COVID-19 misinformation on Twitter. But what was even more interesting to us were the sociodemographic differences. What we found that female Twitter users, racially minoritized individuals, and individuals with lower levels of education in the United States, they experienced a disproportionately higher increase in their anxiety levels when compared to other individuals. So what this study tells us is that it adds to a new body of evidence, and it tells us how important it is for social media platforms and crisis rehabilitation organizations and efforts to think about moderating misinformation, not just countering it and correcting it, but also paying attention to the adverse psychological effects that this information is having on people, and rethinking about how different types of resources may be allocated to particularly vulnerable individuals going forward. So now let's take an example of communities. And we are talking about a specific kind of community in this example, and that is called a situated community, or college campuses here, which are essentially a community with shared experience, which are in a geographically co-located environment. So what we did in this work was we looked at social media, and we were interested in identifying the ways in which college communities' experiences of stress and anxiety vary as they experience crises that are localized to their context. So we proposed here novel computational techniques that allowed us to quantify and examine the various kinds of stress responses that students experience after gun violence incidents happen on college campuses. So we focused on 4 different incidents of gun violence that happened in a 5-year period in several different US-based college campuses, and we looked at those Reddit postings that were shared at the respective subreddits of these 12 schools. On this data, we employed an interrupted time series analysis-based approach that allowed us to measure the extent to which stress responses in the aftermath of these incidents changed with respect to what the stress levels were from before. So we found, probably expectedly to many of you, that the stress responses after these incidents were significantly amplified compared to what it used to be before. That is something you would expect. But what was more insightful and more valuable through the study were the distinct kinds of temporal and linguistic changes that we observed in these campus communities that indicated the unique experience of this crisis. So what were some of those linguistic changes? We found that in the aftermath of these gun violence incidents, these communities showed reduced cognition in their writing of social media postings. They showed higher self-preoccupation as indicated by greater use of first-person pronouns, and they engaged in greater death-related conversations. So now stress is such an important, persistent well-being challenge to college students, right? I don't need to emphasize that because I'm sure a lot of you identify with that. But this impacts people's, and students in particular, their personal, social, and academic lives. But when we have violent events, we have crises, such as gun violence incidents on these college campuses, this may aggravate student stress because it can induce fear, it can induce trauma, and so on. In fact, it's reported that a lot of these incidents that we're talking about here, they affect not just the people who are affected directly by gun violence, but also they have a profound negative psychological impact on the general community. And that's what we are capturing here through the study of social media data. So what this study allows us to do is it allows us to rethink about what interventions and policy approaches could look like that could bring timely help and support to these situated communities going forward. All right, so now talking of the population level studies and the potential that social media offers here, I'll return to the example of the COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the things that I don't have to emphasize or convince you about is that the pandemic has caused significant disruptions in our personal and collective lives in small and big ways. But one of the pandemic that is sort of concomitant with the actual COVID-19 pandemic is the pandemic of mental health concerns. So what our goal in this work was to provide population level insights about people's psychosocial concerns that appeared during the early phase of the pandemic, and by looking to social media to capture those psychosocial concerns. So in this work, we looked at about 60 million Twitter postings that originated from within the United States during the first 3 months of the pandemic, and we compared these with an equally sized data set of Twitter postings from the same time period in 2019, so the year before the pandemic. What we found are significant differences, as you can see in the charts, between the trends pre-pandemic and the trends in the early phase of the pandemic. We found that across all of the examined psychosocial expressions we looked at, there were significant increases during the COVID-19 crisis, something that we would probably incredibly expect. But what was interesting here was that we observed a steady decline and eventual plateauing of a lot of these effects, which you can attribute it to habituation or settling into a so-called new normal that we all keep on talking about these days. When we did language analysis on this data, we found that there were many unique uses of social media that emerged during the pandemic that we probably hadn't quite anticipated before. These include things like people expressing concerns about their personal and professional challenges, the challenges of remote work, healthcare and precautionary measures and the stresses around that, initially about mask wearing, later on about vaccines, and then pandemic-related awareness. But at the same time, there was maybe a positive thing that also came out of this study, and that was people being more willing to take social media to seek support and to engage in candid conversations about mental health. So in many ways, you could say that this kind of population level study tells us in what ways we could think about combating the stigma of mental illness and normalize some of these conversations around mental illness. This study provides us insights also about different kinds of mental health care and policy approaches, especially among public health organizations, about how they can go about planning and implementing measures that not just focuses on the immediate impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also to think about intervention measures that would mitigate the mental health crisis that already has started as the actual pandemic is waning today. So now you might be wondering, this sounds great. What is sort of the next line in this next phase in this line of work? And do you see a real world deployment of some of these algorithms and technologies going forward? And if that hasn't quite happened, what is preventing us from pursuing some of those directions? So I'm going to speak to that in the next few minutes. I believe that there are two important questions that we still need to answer adequately before we can take some of these algorithms and these approaches to fulfill the promise of different kinds of interventions, especially clinical interventions for mental health. The first question is, are the different kinds of inferences that we are getting from social media data, are they valid and efficacious to work on people with actual experiences of mental health? And the second question is about validity. So to answer both of these parts, what we did in this work was to go back to the body of research that exists so far in this space and examining these questions of efficacy and validity based on predictive models that have been built in this space so far, where they're working and where are they not working. So one thing that we note in this work is that a lot of the researchers you see in this area, and that includes a lot of the work that I had done many years back, there has been a tendency to operationalize a variety of different online behaviors as proxies of mental health states. And why is that the case? That is the case because ground truth data in this field is very hard to come by, right? It is very much unlike your typical machine learning tasks where you can have gold standard data in millions by simply asking crowd workers to label, millions of pictures or Twitter postings, for instance. In this case, ground truth data ideally needs to come from clinical assessments by mental health experts. But here's the advantage about proxies. Proxy behaviors are easy to gather. They're easily accessible. They can be inexpensively collected at scale. So this overcomes some of the challenges and burden of obtaining clinical assessments. Not to mention, if you want clinical assessments, you have to think about careful research designs because you're working with a very sensitive population. You have to engage mental health experts and so on. So all these proxies have been pretty powerful so far. They have been widely adopted. And if you're wondering what are some of these proxies, here are some examples on the slide. It could include things like posting that somebody has a lived experience of a certain mental illness. It could imply, following a certain mental health support account. It could imply people engaging in a community of mental health support. So these are all essentially online behaviors that as researchers we take as proxies to indicate the underlying mental health state of a person or the diagnosis that this person might be having. But are we paying a cost by relying on these proxy behaviors? And that is the question about efficacy and validity that we answer in this work. So to do that, what we did is we collected data from Twitter based on 3 different kinds of common proxy behaviors that are being used in the body of research. Affiliation, which is the idea that if you if you're part of a certain community, you post around a certain hashtag, then you are likely to be having a lived experience of that corresponding mental illness. Self-report data, which is the idea of somebody self-disclosing in their Twitter posting that maybe they had a diagnosis of schizophrenia or clinical depression. And then appraise data, which is also a technique that we see often in the existing body of work, is essentially some form of an expert reviewing postings from social media data and coming up with assessments if this could be from a person suffering from a mental health challenge or not. So for each of these proxies, we also collected matched control data, which matched the socio-demographic profiles of the people. So we had some target data set here as well, because remember, we wanted to answer the questions of validity and efficacy. So target data set here is an actual clinical population. These are patients who have been seeking treatment at Northwell Health, one of the partners of this work. And these people have been diagnosed by mental health clinicians to be suffering from a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. Correspondingly, we collected healthy control data. Again, these are individuals who have been evaluated by mental health clinicians to not be suffering from a schizophrenia spectrum disorder or a related mental health concern. The methodology that we engaged here is a methodology called triangulation in the quantitative social science field. Here, the idea is we first establish internal validity by building classification models, so binary classification models of diagnosis on each of the proxy behaviors, and then testing it on a held out data set of the same proxy behavior. And then we have external validity measures where we take the trained models for each of these proxy behaviors and the clinical population, and we try to see how well they perform on an unseen or held out clinical population data set. This is what we found. So if you look at this very simple table, it only reports the simple metric of accuracy here. And you would notice that the cross-validation accuracies, which are essentially a measure of internal validity, all of these three proxy models that are based on proxy behaviors, they perform pretty well. They have anywhere between 70 plus to nearing 90 accuracy, which reproduces observations and related in prior work around these models having very high internal validity. But this is what you need to pay attention to, which is your very rightmost column. When these models were taken and their external validity was tested on an unseen clinical population of schizophrenia patients, the models significantly dropped in their performance, one of the models dropping all the way to a simple 21%. But if you look at the patient model, which is the idea when we train the model on the patient data and we test it on this unseen patient data, that model persistently performs well. So what this tells us is that efficacy can be called into question. A lot of these methods that are being developed, they work great when we stick to the same proxy behaviors. But if you want these algorithms to work in the real world in a clinical context, we have to do better. The issues are not just limited to efficacy. There are questions of validity that are called into question as well. And in particular, here, we were interested in the notion of construct validity, which is the idea that are you measuring what you think you're measuring? In this case, are these models actually measuring a diagnosis of schizophrenia, or they're measuring something else? To answer that question, we looked at the most predictive features for the best performing and the worst performing proxy models. And we also looked at the equivalent set of top features for the patient model or the target population model. And if you were to just eyeball across the top features, you would see that there's actually very little overlap, if at all, between any of these proxy models and the patient model. What this tells us is that when we build these models on proxy data set, they are picking up something. They are performing pretty well, as we saw in terms of internal validity, but the kinds of signals that they're picking up from these social media postings, they're not quite the kinds of signals that a model trained on patient data is likely to pick up. So this calls into question the construct validity for a lot of these models, and it tells us that maybe these proxy models are very good at predicting proxy behaviors, but whether those proxy behaviors are actually indicative of a clinical diagnosis, that is a question we have to give a lot of thought to. So what this work tells us is that it presents a first empirical study that allows us to kind of assess the quality of different social media derived proxy signals that are so common in the literature in predicting various clinical diagnoses of mental health. There is a lot of promise there about designing treatment and patient-provider interventions, but we have to take a pause here. We have to answer questions like, do these diagnostic signals of proxy behaviors, do they actually measure what they claim to measure? And is what being measured by a diagnostic proxy signal, is it valid in itself when it comes to a clinical diagnosis? There could be many reasons that are responsible for these discrepancies. For instance, you could think about population level biases that are responsible. You could think about data sampling biases. You could think about the digital divide related issues. You can think about data set shift, but those are all really important questions for us to think about before we jump into taking these algorithms and designing interfaces and technologies to influence mental health outcomes. But then the challenges in this field are not just limited to these questions of efficacy and validity. There are many additional challenges that we will need to pay attention to going forward and that we'll need to address before we can actually realize the potential of these algorithms. So what are some of these additional issues? These issues could be issues of agency and power about the very individuals with lived experience of mental illness whose data is being studied. There could be unintended negative consequences coming from even good actors, not just bad actors, where predictions that are made on social media data are actually used in a way that harms the individual. And of course, there are questions of ethics, right? There are questions of how do we consent people when we are talking about hundreds of thousands and millions of individuals, and what provisions we need to have in order to prevent adverse outcomes, because this is a very vulnerable population that is at the center of this research. There are questions of how do we represent sensitive life experiences of real human beings in a machine learning or in a computational framework that whose main idea is to form abstractions from data, and therefore inherently a lot of machine learning has a risk of dehumanizing the complex and sensitive human experience. And of course, what is sort of the social and moral responsibility of researchers like us who want to work on these kinds of domains and want to have positive impact in the world, but inherently we also want to make sure that our research doesn't end up harming people. I'm sure you can think about many other questions along these lines, but ultimately what these questions point to is that there is a need for consideration of all of these factors as a part of the research itself, not just as an afterthought. So in the remainder of this talk, I will present a case study that hopefully allows us to think about this potential of social media and machine learning and mental health. And that emphasizes not just the technical possibilities, but also builds measure to tackle these issues that we just highlighted within the research design itself. So the case study that I'm introducing here is an ongoing collaboration between my research team at Georgia Tech and Northwell Health. I briefly mentioned about Northwell Health being a partner in the previous work that I discussed, and this work they have been conducting as a part of a project known as Thrive since the past 5 or 6 years. And our central goal here is to envision a new paradigm of mental health, a paradigm in which we can design and deploy clinical tools and interfaces that are powered by patients' data, social media data that is voluntarily shared by these individuals, and insights that are derived by machine learning that can empower both the clinicians and the patients to achieve better treatment outcomes. So the specific question that we were interested in the research that I'm highlighting here is the question of relapse. Why is relapse such a big question? It is a big question because if you think about some of these serious mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia, even when people are under treatment, which by the way is a pretty small population to start with, even under treatment, about 80% of the patients, they are known to relapse, within a 5-year period. And relapse means significant implications for not just the ongoing treatment of the person, but it has disastrous outcomes for the person's quality of life. It disrupts their professional life, their academic life, their personal life, their social life, their romantic life. You can think about a number of different things. But what puzzles mental health clinicians that we learned from our collaboration with Northwell Health is that it is incredibly difficult to identify risks of relapse in the current paradigm of mental health treatment. Clinicians dream of a future in which there is a possibility to proactively identify markers of relapse rather than retroactively, which is the current paradigm right now. And typically today, mental health clinicians get to know of a relapse after the patient is back with the provider and the symptoms have exacerbated so much that they have to be hospitalized. They are interested in changing the status quo. This is the goal we went with in this work. We first of all collected patient perspectives because one of the questions, if you remember, I noted was the question of agency and power, right? How do you give people whose lived experiences you're studying have adequate power in the research process itself? So what we did here is we conducted a series of surveys and interviews that I'm not going to go into details of, but we what we found through those surveys and interviews of patients who are seeking treatment at Northwell Health is that there was overwhelming support for this research. patients recognize the value that voluntarily sharing this data for research, it can bring significant positive outcomes for their own health and maybe the health of their peers as well. So we follow the best practices in computational psychiatry research in this entire data collection process that we followed as a part of the Thrive initiative. For instance, participants were explained what kind of data is being gathered, how they were planning to be used. And then we also ensured that patients had the agency to remove themselves from the study at any time without it impacting their treatment at Northwell Health in any way. So in this study that I'm reporting here, we consented a little over 100 patients who were clinically diagnosed with a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, and half of whom had experienced at least one relapse-related hospitalizations. All of these individuals agreed to share their Facebook archives with us, and we use that data for the relapse prediction task going forward. So now let me tell you a little bit of the considerations in our modeling approach here. Here we were guided through several iterative discussions with the clinical partner. And that was important because we wanted to not just build an algorithm that predicts relapse, we wanted to build an algorithm that is actually useful to the stakeholders in the real world. What were some of the challenges that we had to consider in this modeling framework? The first challenge was that relapse events are multifactorial. This means that they manifest in many different ways in many different people. One person's experience of relapse or what precipitates a relapse may be totally different from another person. So basically, these kinds of experiences are associated with what is known in the literature as clinical heterogeneity. The second challenge was that there are actually no true positives or true negatives in the setup, because any individual at any point in time will have a non-zero likelihood of relapse going forward. And then what this means is that if you are thinking of applying traditional supervised machine learning, those are not the right class of methods to apply in this modeling task. So to counteract this reality of data and to enhance potential real-world use, which I've been mentioning several times since the beginning, what we did was we modeled the relapse prediction problem as an anomaly detection problem. So we looked at periods of health and periods of relapse for every single patient in our data set. Periods of health were about 1, 2, or 3 month-long baseline data, during which there were no relapse hospitalizations. And then periods of relapse were essentially a month-long period of Facebook data just preceding a relapse hospitalization. So here, these periods of relapse are the anomalies that we are intending to detect. All right, so what did we find? So we found that our anomaly detection approach actually performed really well in this case. It was successful in detecting these so-called anomalies that clinicians look for. When clinicians interact with patients, they are not looking at population level models. They are not asking the question of what predicts relapse, because remember, relapse is a very individualized experience. So what they look for are essentially anomalies. They talk to a patient, they figure out their experiences, and they figure out how their experience at any point in time may have deviated from their typical or baseline experience. So they are manually looking for anomalies. And that is what our modeling approach accomplishes here. In fact, it yields a specificity of 79%, meaning that for 79% of the cases, our model was able to correctly forecast relapse to be relapses as given in our original data. All right, so what this work tells us is that it is possible to utilize social media data in a way that goes beyond sort of population level assessments that a lot of the existing research provides, and allows us to think about what does it mean to target or understand or assess a certain clinical measure of interest, in this case relapse, by looking at or learning from a single individual's behaviors. So what this research tells us is that there is a need for personalized methods that can allow us to longitudinally forecast the likelihood of imminent adverse incidents, in this case being relapse, and how can those insights be practically useful to clinicians. So personalized approaches you may have heard a lot in the context of medicine recently. The whole field of precision medicine is based on that. But essentially the idea here is that how can a person's own experience be used in a way to inform clinical decision-making? In this case, not just informing or empowering the clinicians, but also connecting people with appropriate culturally and context-sensitive technologies that can bring them help, that can bring them support and relief from this suffering. All right, so let's talk a bit more about these personalized approaches. So what could personalized algorithmically powered tools to influence mental health care look like, particularly in the context of this setup that we have been discussing, which is the patient-clinician interaction or the consultation setup. So in this next part of this talk, I'm going to delve into this specific question by looking at two possibilities that we can pursue going forward. One is a narrative-based approach and another is an evidence-based approach. Both of them provide valuable design insights and valuable recommendations for intelligent interfaces in the context of mental health care. So what would be a narrative-based approach? Narrative-based approach is something that comes from the clinical literature and it focuses on patients' own life stories. This is especially a valuable aspect in mental health because mental health patients have unique and very subjective symptomatic presentations, right? So the conversation that you see here, it's a hypothetical conversation on the slide. It shows how patients' own experiences and their stories can impact the clinical decision-making process, in this case, changes in antidepressants that the clinician is prescribing. So even though clinicians have evidence that in this case, all 3 antidepressants work for depressive disorders, but here the person's own narrative is the one that they use to choose, let's say, a drug C over another drug B. And what are evidence-based approaches? So these are essentially interactions where clinicians would heavily rely on established clinical knowledge. So you can think about decision support tools that are a good example of technologies that harness evidence-based approaches. So when you see this example on the slide, this tool provides recommended treatment options on the left, and it shows the evidence on the right side. In this case, it is published research that captures, findings from an ongoing clinical trial. So to explore the narrative-based approach and potential for building intelligent interfaces, we started in this research with 3 different questions. The goal is to think about what kind of design implications can be derived by first asking the question, why and how mental health patients and clinicians discuss social media in the first place during consultations. The second question being, how does discussing social media support or hinder patient-clinician collaboration during these consultations and in treatment in general? And then finally, what are the challenges and concerns that come up when we think about discussions of social media in the context of psychotherapy consultations? So to answer these questions, what we did in this research was we recruited 18 patient participants, and via a series of remote interviews, we asked them about their social media usage, their experiences of discussing social media during consultations with their therapist, as well as the challenges and concerns in sharing of those experiences. So we conducted qualitative analysis of the interview transcripts, and we were able to distill 2 design implications for these future intelligent interfaces for mental health. The first one was that future technologies need to support ephemeral sharing that can promote easier social media discussions during consultations. What this means is that we can envision that if a patient wants to share something from their social media data, the interface can show them during the consultations, but these data or information, because they're so private and so sensitive, they will disappear after that specific context of that consultation is over. So what we see is that ephemeral sharing can be more similar to how patients actually explain their feelings and share their experiences during consultations. Real-world conversations, unless they're recorded, they're inherently ephemeral in nature. Similar to that, we also envision that in future technologies, clinicians can use such an instance of ephemeral sharing to note down specific insights, so takeaways that they may have, and it can become a part of the medical record of the person that includes additional insights that may not be apparent from the typical nature of psychotherapy consultation. The second design implications that we gleaned was that future interfaces need to support intermittent use and sharing. So one of the things that we saw in our interviews in this work was that patients often took breaks from social media. This was very common. And they shared their social media activities only when they thought that there was some activity in there which was maybe important in the context of that conversation or that treatment. So when we think about future technologies, we need to provide them with capabilities that would allow this type of an intermittent sharing of social media data. In other words, future technologies need to hone on a design decision that we are not envisioning a future where social media data is always a part of consultations in every single session, but rather it is something that brings up or becomes an augment or a complement to these conversations when the patient is actively using social media and the patient actively wants to bring up those narratives from those social media postings as a part of the discussions with the clinician. All right, so moving on to now technology design for evidence-based use of social media and mental health consultations. What we did in this work was we focused on contextualizing these computational mental health insights that we discussed earlier, whether it's predictors of depression or schizophrenia or anxiety and stress. How can we contextualize them in a clinical setting? And how can we understand better how clinicians may be able to harness this data and include those in their existing work practices? So here we asked two questions. The first one was, what are the relevant and useful information that can be had from a patient's social media data that a clinician may find to be useful? And the second one was, what kind of challenges and risks of harm did these clinicians see when they wanted to include these computational insights into their existing work practices? So here we adopted an iterative human-centered design approach, wherein we started with an assessment instrument, typically used by mental health clinicians to get insights about mood disorders among their patients. So in this interface, we augmented this tool using computational mental health insights that were derived from a depressive disorder patient population's Facebook data. For instance, in this representation, depressed mood, we provide the frequency of depression indicative postings through the use of a bar chart, simple bar chart. So the suggested usage scenario is that clinicians will ask questions using the question guide on the top for this specific instrument. In this case, it being, how would you describe your mood in the past several days? And then the clinicians will be looking at the bar chart while a patient verbally responds to this interview question. And then the clinician will compile and synergize the patient's verbal self-report with what they're seeing in this representation of their social media data. So to validate this prototype, we conducted focus groups and interviews with 12 clinician participants from Northwell Health. And they provided very detailed accounts of what and how these computational insights can be useful to them. So they specified various types of uses. They said that certain kinds of symptoms can be better understood from these representations. For instance, if you talk about the frequency of posting during late night for an individual, that can be a helpful indicator for the clinician to understand whether patients are in their manic episode, because during a manic episode, many patients would say that they're not sleeping well. So another interesting point that the clinicians mentioned is that they would like to see these kinds of computational insights, not necessarily during the consultation, but actually before the consultation as a way of agenda setting. But then, of course, there were challenges that were noted by these clinicians as well. So the point that opened up, lots of follow-up questions was about how often clinicians would need to check such tools, because these kinds of tools can be updated in real time, and that presents new types of challenges to the work of these clinicians. This kind of work can spill over during times. And it's not just a question of time management at this point about 24/7 monitoring, but it opens up questions of surveillance. It opens up questions of a patient feeling that they're monitored every single time. And importantly, from the clinician's perspective, there are questions of liability, right? What if, late in the night on a weekend, this kind of a representation indicates that the person might be experiencing some kind of an adverse episode. Given that machine learning algorithms are inherently uncertain and they can be wrong, does it mean then the clinician should believe that prediction and go for adopting some kind of a measure to protect the patient, or should they just ignore that? So these are difficult institutional liability questions that will need to be answered going forward. But basically from this work, we learned that it'll be important for these kinds of future intelligent interfaces to not just focus on the positives and the potentials of what can be done, but also answer the questions of what cannot be done or what should not be done. And it echoes current human-centered AI research that highlights the importance of interpretation of experts rather than essentially and necessarily focusing on getting the best performance algorithm. So to enable experts, in this case clinicians, to take advantage of these kinds of machine learning models, we will need to think about how do we empower these experts and prepare them for adjustments of their interpretations and expectations from an underlyingly inherently uncertain technology. All right, so I would start to close at this point. So in this talk, I described how many kinds of interdisciplinary approaches may be adapted in computational context, particularly in how big data and machine learning can support better understanding and assessment of mental health outcomes, and then how might we begin to imagine interfaces and tools that are powered by these assessments, that are powered by these machine learning algorithms that may support the needs of various mental health stakeholders. But then beyond the specific problems I discussed, hopefully what this talk helps you to ponder over is the need for a participatory, a collaborative, multi-stakeholder faceted research program so that we can pay attention to some of these outstanding challenges and concerns that still remain in this field. I would note maybe a few open questions if it excites you going forward, and I would love to hear questions from you about that in the next several minutes. So what are some of the questions that keep me awake at night these days? The first one is that how can we consider, when do we know that these algorithms are ready for real world use, right? What performance and evidence base would be enough for us to take that step, right? Like when can we take this prototype that I just described and actually implement it in an actual clinic with actual clinicians and actual patients, right? That's a question that keeps me awake at night. And the reason this is a difficult question is that we all know, like I said, machine learning models are inherently uncertain. We can improve the performance. We can go from a 91% accurate algorithm to maybe even a 95%, but then we will never be able to be 100% perfect. And accuracy, as we know, it varies by socio-demographic groups. So now, instead of focusing all our attention on building the most accurate algorithm, I believe we need to ask the following question, which is how do we support graceful failure when our data or models we know in some situations will not be able to stand up to the potential use case? In other words, if I were to draw from medical training that doctors get, I think the value system underlying a lot of these future technologies needs to be the Hippocratic Oath, which is doing no harm. The next question that I think about all the time is that how do we address issues of social justice that often come up when we are thinking about computational algorithms that make very sensitive inferences about people's sensitive and personal life experiences? How do we ensure that the models we are building have not just an opportunity to help people, but at the very least, doesn't exacerbate existing societal inequities. And finally, the thought I want to leave with is, what is a path forward, right? And an approach where these questions are not just afterthoughts in a talk of this format, but actually these are issues that we consider in our very methodologies in the building of the algorithms and the interfaces themselves. All right, so that is all what I have. Thank you very much for listening. Before I end, I would like to acknowledge all my collaborators and my students, some of whom you see here. I just couldn't fit everybody on this one slide, but also I would like to acknowledge the sponsors of this research, without whose generous support, none of this would be possible. I'm just a small player in the bigger ecosystem. All right, so that's what I have, and I believe I have time for a few questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Munmun. Fantastic talk, really, really interesting. And we invite questions either in the chat, but we're very happy to get the questions if you raise your hand live. I have one quick question, and I also ask everybody else for understanding to maybe ask succinct questions, so not so then I have to really show the examples. So now that social media is evolving, how do you think this kind of research transfers in places like virtual reality? Thank you.
Yeah, metaverse is the future, isn't it? I think these questions will equally be important. I think one thing that we have recognized in the last 2 years is that we can never predict the future. We can definitely never predict the future when it comes to technology. But what is unique about this kind of work and similar HSN work is that mental health is core to human experience. It is going to be an ongoing challenge for us going forward. And whether we are talking about mental health in the context of the offline world, or we are talking about virtual reality or metaverse, I think these questions would remain. Any technology that is touched by the human experience, I think these are questions that we will need to answer going forward. Of course, there are opportunities that might open up when we talk about virtual reality. We already know that virtual reality has a promising future as an intervention paradigm, maybe to help people overcome traumatizing experiences through exposure therapy. But at the same time, new technology also opens up new kinds of challenges that we may not have quite anticipated at the moment. So I think we will have to be on our toes going forward to think about both the opportunities and the challenges in this field.
Thank you. I give the floor to Peter. Peter, thank you.
Hi, Munmun. Thanks for really great talk. It's really nice to see how broad is now the area of your research interests. And it's amazing that you also have some experience in personalization. So for me, interesting challenge is, which I don't really expect it to be solved in this keynote, is helping users through social media in a personalized way. Unlike other people who try to adapt to user interests, but try to adapt to their level of knowledge, their expertise. And I wonder, you have so much experience with social media. Is there any evidence that user posts on social media discussion forums can provide some evidence about their level of knowledge, their level of expertise? Or it is completely kind of masked by really very terse and short social media formats? So we shouldn't really even try to do that.
So when you say expertise, Peter, do you mean expertise in mental health or something else?
Expertise, let's say, managing their own disease, right? Expertise in literature and clinical studies about their disease. So apparently, more experienced people speak in different words. And if you can write a whole paper, yes, well, we see it. But the social media is such a unique format. It's not clear whether in the short 5 lines, you can really guess how informed the person is. And if you can, we can advise something which is on personalized level, something on the right level of reading. But can we? We actually struggle with that. Maybe you have some advice to us.
Yeah, no, that's such an important question, especially for mental health. In related areas, there have been a bunch of work on adverse drug reactions by looking at social media data. So that's a good situation where we are relying on the expertise of social media users to tell us about adverse reactions to certain drugs. I think in the mental health context, the opportunities go in various ways. for many mental health illnesses, we know about a set of symptoms, but we possibly don't know about the entire universe of symptoms, right? So social media can be a place where we can use the expertise of these individuals to learn about previously unknown symptoms or impacts of certain medications. And I think there is an opportunity for the medical science field to tap into those individualized experiences of individuals and fill some of the gaps that exist in medical knowledge. I think in terms of whether we can actually get that by looking at, a post of 5 words, that's a good question. I think, one of the paradigms and approaches that we have adopted and seem to have worked well is to not think about individual postings, but the trajectory of a person's use of social media data. What is it that they have been doing or saying, or how have they been using this platform over weeks and months and years? And normally you can get a much richer sense of the person's experience or expertise through those types of analysis rather than by looking at their individual postings.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Munmun. Is there another question? I, of course, have another one ready, as I have really many, but Simone, go ahead.
Thanks, Munmun, for a really fantastic talk. I really enjoyed that. I have a sort of more practical question, especially related to also some work that I've been doing in healthcare technologies, and that is always you come up with a fantastic kind of solution. You can prove it actually works. And then you're faced with, well, how do you deploy it once the funding stops by NSF or anywhere else? And quite often, healthcare technologies are not very attractive for venture capitalists to sink the money into. So do you have any advice how to go about bringing what we develop in research into clinical practice?
Yeah, well, it's a hard question. Let me preface my answer with that. I think, I completely agree with you. I have had similar experiences. I have talked with startups, companies, and they want to take something that will make them money in the next quarter. And a lot of these technologies, to be honest, are blue sky technologies. They're not quite there. They're not going to make anybody money in the next 4 months. What I have seen to be more valuable is to engage with advocacy organizations. I've just started to do that over the last couple of years. And, it is heartening to see what these organizations already do, the way they represent the voices of people with lived experience. And I believe the future probably lies in that space. How do we actually take the technology to the very people who we are trying to help? Maybe there is a future of a citizen science-driven approach, a participatory approach in the adoption of these technologies to ensure that we actually move it forward beyond sort of the 4 walls of the research labs and into the real world. That said, it's not easy to engage with these advocacy organizations, but I think that is something that as academics, we are never trained to do. But I always tell my students that this is a valuable skill set to develop if you want to do interdisciplinary work.
Thank you so much. Is there another question? We have time for one last question. I can, if there is no other, I can ask the last question, which is, have you thought of utilizing other type of data together with the social media data? Yeah,
very important question. And we have. I unfortunately didn't have a chance to include that in my presentation today, but we have other work that we have conducted where social media data was combined with passively sensed data to make individual level inferences of mental health attributes. So we combine social media data with wearable data, smartphone sensed data, geolocation data, and so on. And then we have other work where at a population level, we combine social media data with other population level insights to get over some of the representational issues, which is that not everybody uses social media. So in some work that we did with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC here, was to develop estimates of suicide fatalities in the United States by combining social media data with data from emergency department visits throughout the country. We looked at calls that were played on the National Suicide Prevention Helpline and so on. So that was a holistic approach where social media was a part of a larger ecosystem of a richer set of data sets that allows us to represent different parts of a population and allows us to capture those experiences that may not be represented on social media.
Fascinating, Munmun. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to invite everybody at 10:05. We have our social program, which is in a way our conference dinner, let's say a dinner for the soul, because it is music. I hope you enjoy it. It's, I think, Cash, it's in the same link. So it's you don't even have to walk very far to continue. And yes, so thank you very much, Munmun. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me and for the excellent questions. And hopefully I'll get to meet some of you at least in the near future in person. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So Cash, I think we are having some sound test on the other line, and maybe I can tell our friends to join us here.
Yes, Sasa just reported to me that the sound test went well, so they're ready.
Whoa,
yeah, they
fantastic.
already joined us back in this channel, I believe. Everything is going great.
Yeah, but there is one technical problem originated by me. I cannot put anymore the IUI background, guys. I don't know, it has disappeared from all my menus. It says that I need to check in the web, you know, the settings in the web. I checked and it's all fine. It's just a weird things happening. But so just imagine there is a IUI background. Very good. So very soon we'll welcome the music. How was the test?
Great. I think they are already here.
Excellent. So
Should I make
hello
a poll?
everyone.
Oh, there you go.
We are here.
Lucy, let's wait. I will start at 10:05. To Cash, to solve the background issues, I thought I would exit and come in again. You think it's wise, or it's better not to change anything?
It's fine. You're not a host, nor are you streaming.
So nothing should happen. Thanks.
Рекламная пауза. Вы нас чуете?
Do you hear us?
Excellent. So let's start our program. Thank you, Cash, for all the support. Now we are live, and I'd like to welcome very warmly our social program main act, which is the Folknery, a Ukrainian free folk band by Volodymyr Muliar and Yaryna Kvitka. And I wanted to welcome you and ask you just a couple of questions before we start the music. One thing I really liked about listening to your music is that there is one component that is very much done, let's say, in the moment. And so that I thought that was a very nice idea to try to have a really true music that basically conveys emotion very how it is this part of your approach to music. We don't hear.
And now?
Yes.
We are? Hello,
yes.
everyone. For me, music, voice, instruments are like some energy. And if, for example, me as a vocalist wants to sing in something, and what kind of energy I have in this moment, I will send it. We did lots of expeditions through Ukrainian villages and discovering Ukrainian old songs. And it was very interesting how one song can be different in different villages, because each woman singing their story through these words of lyric, I mean. Yeah, so, and we like to be true with ourselves and to share this truth of music with our friends and audience.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to ask the host to make me disappear completely, and I would like to leave the stage completely to Folknery. Please, let's enjoy your music. The stage is yours.
Thank you. The only thing I want to tell before we will start to play that today we play for our country. As you know, it's very difficult and very important time right now for our country. And today we play for our country, for all strong and brave people who fight against fascism of 21st century called Russism. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And now we go to a deep Ukrainian cultural music. Thank you. А ми взагалі в прямому ефірі?
Yes.
Very nice. Thank you so much.
Our life beginning with the mother's song, Lullaby. And it was Lullaby. And we also use these traditional songs in our culture, in Ukrainian culture. And even me, I every time singing this song to my son. And it's like magic and to fall off sleep, you know? It's like meditation. In our music, we are using traditional songs, traditional lyrics, and all of our music is about Ukrainian culture, and we try to do the connection between old and new, like we give new life of old songs. And our next song is Ivanko, a very famous Slavonic name, Ivanko. It's about love and hate and relationship between man and woman. next, our song. It's quite song from quite popular celebration. So we have Christmas time. In Ukraine, it's long Christmas time. So our Christmas time start 6th of January and finish 19th of January. So it's like 2.5 weeks. No, 2 weeks. And during this time, we go from house to house, group of people, and singing songs. And the first part of Christmas time in Ukraine, we call it kolядки. Kolядки. I don't know how to translate in English. And this song will be from that part of Ukrainian traditional celebrating of Christmas. Василя, роди, Боже, жито, пшеницю й усяку пашницю. А ви, дівчатка, молодчатка, кажіть: дай Боже, дай Боже, дай Боже! Пас Василько, so much. Our band Folknery, we think that very important for each nation and for each country to keep our traditions, our music, our identification. Yeah, this is the identification of nations, language, music, traditions, culture, costumes. And I don't know why, but it may be historical parts of Ukrainian life that we every time singing. My grandmother, she was singing every time. She cooking something, she was singing. She goes to a field, she was singing. And I remember my childhood as with lots of traditional songs. When we grow, I thought, it's like quite boring and it's not interesting. But now, maybe last 10 years, I changed my mind. I think that it's very important to each nation to keep it and to give it new life and to share this culture, not just share for sharing, just to show other people what is my country, what is Ukraine, what kind of music we have.
And it makes our world really beautiful.
Yeah, we are traveling a lot, so we visit 42 countries, and we like to discovering music of different countries. And I think it's very important thing in each country, in each nation, music, traditional music.
Thank you.
But music, what we are performing now, it's not the the same traditional music of Ukraine. It's just a traditional lyric text, but the arrangement, it's arrangement how we feel these old songs. That's it.
In our time, yes.
Yeah, and we traveling a lot in Ukraine. In different parts of Ukraine, it's very different everywhere, in the north, in the west, in the Carpathian Mountains. And we saw lots of, in the villages, lots of some magic, you know, some not only magic, how to, some mystic. And if we read the text of old songs, we can see lots of this mystic. And that's why we feel this old music like that. And now we give this music new life, as we can explain it. Thank you very much. Um, Today is 1 month from the beginning of war in Ukraine, and we have some regions very destroyed by Russian army. And last 1.5 years, we lived in the north of Ukraine, northeast. We call this region Chernigivska Oblast, and this part also we call Polisia. And we have in our culture very famous Polisia songs, and they have special elements of singing. And now we will sing song from the preparation of a celebration of wedding party. And this song is especially from this northeast part of Ukraine.
Thank you so much. Beautiful. Thank you.
And also we have very famous celebration of Ivana Kupala. It's a magic night. Before Christian, we celebrate this night and at the end of June, but now the calendar changing, and we celebrate this night from 6 to 7 of July. And it's very beautiful celebration, a very important group of people gather together, especially young, not married, and somewhere near the river or lake, they gather together, singing, dancing, make a big fire, and jumping on this fire or through this fire. And it's about this celebration about like man, boy, he like searching his future wife during this night, and they singing a lot. And one of these songs from this celebration will be right now. Thank you. Thank you. And one more song. We named this song Vibration. Just a vibration between people, between
Everything.
yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And last, we want to thank all of you. Also, we want to say thank you to all world who supporting Ukraine now and who help Ukraine now. And also we want to say thanks for volunteers for Ukrainian army who are now protecting our territory from danger, from war, and from Russia. And because Ukrainians are very, every time stepping with songs, and we have very strong song now. It's Ukrainian anthem, and at the last minutes of our performing, we want to singing.
Yeah, but first, it's important to us and important to every Ukrainian. We want to ask you for a moment of silence for many people who already died in this war.
Слава Україні! Героям слава! Thank you.
Thank you so much. Big hugs to you from the whole conference. Many
Hugs
people
for
liked
all-
it.
For all world. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We was really glad to be here today, and all the best to you, all of you.
Thank you.
You too.
If anybody wants to say something, go ahead to say goodbye. Anybody can say anything. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Have a
Bye.
have a good night.
You too.
too.
Thank you.